Welcome everybody to Baseline Tech Talk Tuesday. I'm Andy Humphrey, Irrigation Consultant for Baseline. We have Chris Wright, VP of Sales. Today, we're back with another engineered solutions discussion about upper limit, AKA upper threshold watering. And if you're joining us for the first time, you can watch all of the previous Tech Talks on Baseline's YouTube channel. It's Baseline Web Training, all one word on YouTube. And Chris, I just looked between the last time that you and I did a Tech Talk live, there are 4 new videos on YouTube. So Dan, the training manager, has added a video talking about mobile access. He's added a video talking about manual operation of a base station 3200 at the controller. He also added a video about manual operation through Base Manager. So please keep the YouTube channel in mind and use it as a training portal and as a support reference whenever you're out in the field or at home or in the office. It's available to you. So welcome everyone. And we're excited to have a deep dive into upper limit watering today.
For sure. All right, so let's get started with a little bit of content to share. And as a reminder, and like I start every presentation, I like to enforce the fact that Baseline is an engineered irrigation solution that utilizes proprietary 2-wire technology and real-time sensor data to enhance system performance. And that's really plays in directly to what we're going to be talking about today with upper limit watering. And certainly aligns with the engineered solution offered by our soil moisture sensor technology. So again, to reprise, Baseline utilizes patented soil moisture sensor technology to measure in real time evapotranspiration as it happens in the landscape, right? So we're measuring in real time evaporation out of the soil and transpiration through the plant material that depletes that soil moisture content that we replace either with precipitation or with irrigation and sprinkler systems.
Yep. And what we're going to look at, I think this is great, Chris, because when we start looking at the details of upper limit watering, sometimes you see things that might not make complete sense when you first look at it. And so we know that wind, for instance, just as an example, is a part of evapotranspiration as it happens in the landscape. So if you were watering while it was very windy, perhaps the water wouldn't reach the sensor. And if that were the case, it might water longer than you expected it to. And that's because we're measuring evapotranspiration as it happens real time in the landscape.
True. Yep. And the replenishment requirement could be drastically different in real time as it's happening, right? So you might get run times that are behaving differently than if you were operating off of a normal lower threshold strategy. So, to reinforce what Andy was just talking about, we're applying the water through the irrigation system. And it's what we're really looking to do is to automate the watering strategy, either based on runtime or on frequency of irrigation cycles to fulfill that plant water requirement or management objectives. And I think the management objectives comes into play in today's discussion as well, as we're talking about the use of upper limit watering strategy when there are restrictions that are in place that may limit your opportunities to actually water.
Yep, exactly.
So when would we want to use an upper limit strategy? And we're going to focus, and we kind of came into this today based on watering restrictions due to the severe drought that's impacting the Western United States. We know that water restrictions are coming into play and being enforced. In fact, LA County, Inland Empire, and Orange County are all under a 1-day-a-week water restriction currently because of the drought conditions. So upper limit strategy can help manage that so that you're applying the amount of water that is needed or required within your given water window that's available to you. So if you got limited number of days to water, or a limited amount of water available, that upper limit strategy could come into play. But keeping in, theme with HydroPoint's marketing strategy and messaging for the month of May, upper limit strategy also has a lot of relevance in sports turf applications for maintaining the quality of the playing surface, or if you're having to manage to concussion or injury protocols, you can use that strategy to, maintain a certain level of moisture in that playing field.
Mm-hmm.
Green roof applications where we're maintaining a managed moisture content, or if we're looking to retain a reservoir in that soil profile on a green roof for storm events, upper limit watering strategy can be used just to water to a certain level, leaving the rest of the soil dry for a storm event.
Yeah, I think that one is often missed, because when we think of green roofs, we think of plants that have a very low water requirement. And, often, sprinkler systems are either temporary, or they're nixed off the project, or they're just set on a time basis, or even an ET weather based component. And it's important to remember that, there needs to be as much of that soil profile available to capture the rain event, because one of the biggest reasons for the green roof is to capture and slow the rate of runoff. And if we had just watered the green roof and filled it all the way up, where we have less room to capture that rain event. So using sensors and in upper limit, we can control where that upper limit is set. And maybe on a green roof, we need a lower upper limit just so that we can have more room available to capture that rainwater.
Absolutely. Do you still have your pint glass available right there?
Oh, you mean this Brew Crew?
That Brew Crew pint glass? Yeah, that one's from Brew Crew in Minneapolis.
Circa 2015. Absolutely.
I recall.
So, you might think of upper limit as being full, because it can mean that. And in a landscape, it often does mean field capacity, and field capacity means filling up this glass just before it spills over. That would be sort of the definition of field capacity, but we can set the upper limit anywhere in this range. So on a green roof, maybe the upper limit is set just above maximum allowable depletion, so that we're keeping a profile that's not nearly as wet as if we kept it at field capacity, because we want this room to be available for that rain event. So using sensor technology, we can, outside of a rain event, we can ensure that the irrigation system never waters above that limit.
Correct. Yeah. And in a typical landscape application, it's relevant too, because during a restriction period, you may not need to, or want to, or be allowed to water all the way to field capacity for that soil profile. You're just watering to a point where you're keeping, plant material alive. Yep. So upper limit does not always have to coincide with filling the soil profile all the way to field capacity.
Right. And I think in a couple slides, we're going to talk about that. And if you look at your first bullet point there, limited number of days, if you can only water 1 day a week, would it really make sense to run your irrigation system for 16 hours? It wouldn't, because you're just filling it up, and then it's just your soil can only hold so much water. And so if we filled it up and then we stopped it, that's all the water that's required, because that's all the water that the soil can hold. And that becomes sort of the purpose of upper limit in that use case, is let's water all the way up to field capacity and stop, so we have that tank absolutely full to get us the most number of days we can before we're allowed to water again.
Right. Exactly. All right. And then another, non-landscape use that can be utilized by upper limit strategy with the sensors is in level control for, cisterns or wells or pond features, water features, etc. But it could also be used to not oversaturate a soil profile as well, right? And we've talked about a use case before where sensors were buried at a depth well below the root zone of the turf grass, and the intent was to manage or monitor how much irrigation water is filtering through that soil profile before it gets into say a contaminated plume that you don't want to add water to because of groundwater discharge. So you can use that upper limit to stop irrigation cycles so that you're not oversaturating the soil profile as well. Okay. All right. Very good. So how does the upper limit strategy algorithm work in a baseline controller? And I think this is, one of the use cases or functions of a base station controller that is little understood. And if we do initiate an upper limit strategy, it may result in operational behavior that's not expected, and you may not know what is actually happening, and you may think that something's wrong, right? And which could lead to a support call or something else. So what we want to do is explain to you how the algorithm works so that you know, and so that can manage operation, but also manage expectations of how it will operate.
Yep. So you can set it up to the expectation of the behavior that you want from it, because the user has to go through some initial programming to get the outcome that they're looking for.
Yep. All right. So if anybody has interfaced with our soil moisture sensors and, utilized upper limit strategy, or even thought about or use the auto calibration feature that's available to you, we can go in and let the system operate and find what field capacity is for that soil profile that the sensor is buried in. And this process can take, a matter of minutes or an hour, or it could take several days, depending on how dry that soil profile is when you start the calibration process, and then also depends on the type of soil that you have as well, right? So that process can take a bit. But once we find that field capacity, we can adjust it, right? So that we can manage to an upper limit that we want. We'll tell you how much your soil will be able to hold, but you don't have to use that as the upper
Just
limit.
like if we knew this was 16 ounces is what it could hold, we could decide to keep upper threshold at 13 ounces or 12 ounces or 10 ounces.
Correct. Yep. So that it's an adjustable limit. And then we can set up programming to water to that adjustable limit. So the best way to operate on an upper limit is to create hydrozones across your site, and to identify a primary zone that is representative of other zones within that hydrozone, and then link like zones to that primary zone. Okay. So for our listeners, Andy, describe what a hydrozone is.
Yeah. A hydrozone are sprinkler types that are the same, or landscape zones that are similar. So we're creating a group, and a group might be, for instance, all of your turf grass rotor zones. It might be all of your turf grass spray zones. It could be all of your shrub drip zones or your shrub spray zones. And so instead of putting one sensor per zone, we're going to use one sensor per group. And if you just have a residential house, which is, again, not a great baseline use case, you might just have one hydrozone. A little more complicated, it might be two, or it might be three. And on a larger site, there could be 15 or 20 different hydrozones, just based on how complicated and the setup is and what the complexities are.
Yeah. And how much resolution the manager may want across that entire site to manage the frequency and or duration of irrigation cycles,
yep.
right?
And one of the misconceptions that typically sun versus shade does not differentiate a hydrozone. That is a micro adjustment made to an individual zone of the hydrozone. So if we were using this example of all of the turf grass rotor zones, let's say there's 10 of those around a site. The zone that is on the north side behind the building that's in the shade a little bit of the day might only get 75% of the water as it's linked versus what the primary zone is. The zone that's up on the berm that tends to dry out more frequently, you can adjust that to 125%. So you make your micro adjustments per zone based on exposure and such to that hydrozone.
Okay, so just to clarify, your primary zone has linked zones to it, and you can adjust the linked zones as a percentage of that primary zone to account for minor microclimate differences that may be associated with shade, light levels, reflection, things like that, right? Without requiring another sensor just for that individual or other group of zones.
And a lot of times it's easy just to kind of ballpark, and instead of filling out these complicated zone detailed descriptions, hey, this zone over here is in the shade, I'm going to put it at 80%. This one over here, its exposure is more, I'm going to bump it up. And sometimes just using percentages is a really quick and oftentimes a better way than using these sort of scheduling calculators that are out there.
Perfect. All right. So another important thing in or component of the algorithm in upper limit watering strategy is that you do have to put in a zone runtime for each of the zones in that hydrozone. Correct. So even though we're regulating the amount of runtime that's happening with upper limit watering strategy, you still need to have a programmed zone runtime in the system for that primary zone and then the linked zones as well.
Yeah. Okay, so you set the primary zone, and when you link it, the link automatically gets the primary zone's runtime, and then you can adjust it up or down. So it's almost a faster way to program to some extent, because you only have to set the runtime to the primary. And when you link the others, they get that runtime by default at 100, and then you can move them up or down.
Correct. Okay. All right. So once we have that established, then we have a start condition that will initiate an irrigation cycle, right? So with upper limit strategy, you need to have a start time, right? And we're telling the controller what days to water on at that start time. So if we're only able to water twice a week, for instance, we would have a start time for each one of those days that we're allowed to water that will initiate the upper limit watering strategy. Okay.
Yep. And that's the key word. And I think we'll hit it on the next slide. Is the upper limit. Really, the simplest way to think of it is it's a stop condition. It tells you when to stop watering. User gets to decide when to start watering.
Exactly. Okay. So when that start condition is initiated and system starts to run, if upper limit is reached within the primary zone runtime, okay, then all of the linked zones will operate for that same time that the primary zone operated for. If that upper limit is not reached within the primary zone runtime, the linked zones will run for the full runtime, just like the primary zone. And then at the next available start condition, the primary zone will operate for the programmed zone runtime plus an additional 20% of that program time. So if I've got a 20-minute runtime, then at the next start time, my primary zone is going to run for 24 minutes, right? Rather than 20 minutes, 20% more in an effort to reach that upper limit. If it does not reach that upper limit within that operation, then at the next available start time, it will operate for the zone runtime plus 40%. So it will operate for 28 minutes versus 20 minutes in an effort to make up and hit that upper limit. And it'll go through that process until it operates to 200% of the programmed zone runtime. And then if it still doesn't see upper limit in that, it will send you a message telling you that upper limit has never been met and that you need to adjust your programming.
Yep.
Okay. So that's an important thing to understand about upper limit watering, is that you're going to get a variability of runtime that may exceed what your expected behavior is of those zones. And you may, come back to us and say, my hell, I'm running like 30 minutes, 40 minutes longer than the runtime in the program.
And as
what's wrong?
Sort of mentioned at the beginning, if it's very, very windy, that's a great example of when that behavior may occur, because the water just simply isn't reaching the sensor. And if you're not on site to know that it is windy and you're looking at a graph and run times of yesterday's data, you have to ask yourself, I wonder why it ran that long. And likely there's a very environmental reason why it ran that long. It's rare that a contractor leaves a piece of plywood on top of the sensor and blocks the water.
Mm-hmm.
And if that were to happen, the use case here is it will only run 200%. It will not water all day long until it reaches. It has a maximum.
It does have a limit.
Spot. Yep,
exactly. And then it will message you and telling you that you need to make programming adjustments. Yep. All right. So that explanation really reinforces the need to utilize cycle and soak when using upper limit watering strategy, because if that upper limit is met during any cycle within the programmed runtime for that primary zone, it will stop that cycle, and then the linked zones will operate for that amount of time that primary zone ran in those cycles without applying a next cycle if it still has additional cycles.
And that's probably the most important thing. Like, if you remember nothing from today, just remember that a 60-minute runtime that only has one cycle, right? One cycle, no soaks, will always run for 60 minutes regardless, because the controller cannot interrupt a cycle. It will run a cycle, then determine if it needs another one or another one or another one. So a 60-minute runtime should be broken out into 2, 3, 4, 5, however many cycles you determine is necessary and you want the resolution for, so that it can reduce those numbers of cycles and only water just a little bit.
Yeah. And in working with clients, it really makes sense to try to apply 3 cycles, right? Especially if you're watering on limited days, because the first cycle will break the surface tension of the soil. The second cycle will help to accelerate that capillary action. And then the third cycle will help to drive it deeper into the soil profile, right? So our recommendation is 3, depending on your soil type. It may not ultimately be required, but you need to have a soak time in long enough to allow that application of water from the cycle to infiltrate that soil profile.
Yeah. And if you're making it your life goal to stop watering exactly at field capacity, you will really need to become a soak and cycle expert and really program that resolution. And it can be done, but sometimes it's not worth the benefit of stopping exactly at field capacity. You just get as close as you can based on how it makes sense for your property.
Correct. Yep. All right. So what are some of the programming recommendations for success? And this is outside of everybody's typical comprehension of how they should program their controller when using upper limit strategy, but reinforcing again, you need to have a long enough runtime so that the system can operate long enough to get to upper limit without creating those scenarios of overcompensating on future operation in order to reach that upper limit. Okay. So is what we recommend is to go in when using upper limit strategy and set a runtime that would allow somewhere around an inch of application of water. Okay. Now that seems like a lot, especially if you're thinking in terms of evapotranspiration. You're like, on a hot day, I'm usually depleting, a 1/4 inch to maybe a third of an or Yeah, third of an inch of water, right? So why would I ever want to apply a full inch? The point is that you won't be applying a full inch of water because there isn't any soils that could really hold an inch of water in the first place. It's just allowing that cycle enough time to get through the upper limit watering strategy. Okay, so if you've got rotors or rotating nozzles at half an inch an hour, you might set your runtime for as much as 2 hours or maybe an hour and a half, 90 minutes. Okay, for sprays, at 1.6 inches per hour, you may set those to be able to operate for 40 minutes, where you typically set them to operate for 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, you're just looking at providing enough runtime so that it can get through its cycle and soak process to hit that upper
kind of like
limit.
Giving it the water window, giving it the opportunity to water 2 hours. If it, for some reason, were literally that dry, which is not likely, but if it were, you're giving it that opportunity to apply that much water. But in reality, it's only going to apply what is required, which is one cycle. If we have our cycle set for 15-minute intervals, maybe it's just one 15-minute cycle is all it took to fill it back up. Because that time, we're letting the sensor choose the runtime. The user chooses the potential runtime. The sensor chooses the actual runtime.
Correct. Okay. And then if you get in a situation where, you are exceeding your available water window because there's just not enough time, then it allows you to consider, priorities. One consideration would be lowering your limit so it wouldn't run as long, right? Or shorten your primary zone runtime, or set program priorities so that you are irrigating higher priority turf before lower priority turf.
So Chris, we've got 2 minutes. I think we should jump to your slide with the graph.
Okay.
Review it so people have a visual. And, Ty has a question that I'll just hit real quick. He asks if, so is the primary zone to match the link zones with primary zone based on precipitation rate? And yeah, hydrozoning, it's based on precipitation rate. So when I said sprays and then rotors and then drip, you do want to hydrozone based on precipitation rate if possible.
Correct. Yep. All right. So looking at a upper threshold watering strategy graphically, you can see here that an upper limit strategy was likely initiated following July 2nd watering. Okay, so we had a watering happen for 41 minutes that was just below the upper limit setting that came into play afterwards. So we filled up and then we're drying down. And then from this point forward, we want to try to irrigate to that upper limit strategy, right? So it'll take maybe a couple of cycles to calibrate in, right? But in this case, they likely had, a cycle soak set up so that it applied the first cycle, which got it back above that upper threshold, and then did not operate a second cycle, right? And then it depleted down to the next opportunity to water, which was on a Tuesday, and it had dried down a bit more. So it applied a first cycle. They likely added another cycle soak in the programming. So it applied maybe a second cycle to get it above, and then it just continued to operate in that fashion until it got to a pretty stable condition where runtimes were similar going forward up to that upper limit.
Yep. And just to confirm what you mentioned earlier, Chris, the schedule was set by the user. Tuesdays and Saturdays, water Tuesday and Saturday at a start time. We don't know what the start time was, but there was a start time. And then the controller is adjusting the runtime or the amount of water based on trying to stop at that upper threshold limit. And that's why we see these alternating run times, but a fixed schedule.
Yep. And depending on the evapotranspiration that happened out of that soil profile, or depending on what conditions were like when they were irrigating, i.e. wind, maybe on July 20th, when they were irrigating, it was a little windier. So
it was hot,
and it was hotter. So it took an additional application or an additional cycle in order to get it up above that upper threshold, so that we replenished to a limit that we desired.
Yeah.
So
I think, we're kind of coming up at the end. What I find most fascinating is when you start using these tools, you actually really start learning how to water better. So even if you have a site or not somebody else's control system, looking at this data and teaching yourself how to water with sensors really helps you understand all of the components that are going into watering correctly. And sometimes you can take what you've learned through automation, and now you're a smarter user, and you can use that knowledge to better program controllers from the beginning. And it's pretty awesome to watch it happen in real time, because sometimes what you think is going to happen doesn't actually play out that way. Then you get to ask yourself, I wonder why it didn't do what I thought it was going to do. And then you start unlocking the reasons why. And it's really interesting.
Can be, for sure. All right. So we're at the bottom of the hour. 30 minutes goes way too fast. So we appreciate the time spent with us today. Hopefully this was good information, created some critical thinking about how you can use baseline technology in different ways to accomplish desired objectives or outcomes. If you'd like to view this again, it will be available on the YouTube channel at Baseline Web Training, all one word, on YouTube. So you can reference it again and share it too, if you'd like, with colleagues or other irrigators or landscape managers, so they can learn how to use our technology as well. So with that, we will sign off for today. Thanks for joining us, and we will be back in a couple of weeks for another live episode with Chris and Andy. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
See
you
ya.
out there. Bye.